nearly half of the South African population has either been unable to pay their debts or they've lost jobs due to COVID-19. This is one of the results discovered by the 2021 South African Reconciliation Barometer. The study found that 1 in 4 respondents, which is 24%, identified hunger as well as the health of family members as their primary concerns during this period. To better explain these findings, I'm joined by Mr. Mikhail Moosa, who is project leader for the SA Reconciliation Barometer at the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation. Mr. Moosa, thank you so much for your time today. So talk us through the barometer and the results of this survey. What are the latest statistics saying as far as South Africans and their seeming inability to be repaying their debt?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So the South African Reconciliation Barometer is a nationally representative public opinion survey that's carried out every 2 years by the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. And the point of the barometer is really to give ordinary South Africans a voice in the policy-making process. We go around the country to all 9 provinces. We interview people face-to-face in multiple languages. It's very representative of the adult population. And we're trying to get a sense of what people think about South Africa, how they think about society, whether they trust one another, whether they trust their government. These are issues that we focus on every time we do the survey. However, in the latest issue, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic, something that we couldn't have foreseen 2 years ago, but something we wanted to gauge this year. And what we really tried to get a sense of was just how people are dealing with the pandemic. So there's been lots of economic studies looking at unemployment, social grants, for example, but we wanted to get a sense of how are people handling the pandemic. And what we find is really quite shocking and very stark, the sort of financial circumstances that people are living in, where nearly half of South Africans, as you say, are struggling to pay debts, have lost most of their income. You know, many people are very concerned about feeding their family. Food insecurity is incredibly important nowadays, especially with the economic shock of the pandemic. So what we find in our survey is that the sort of economic effects of the pandemic have been really quite substantial, so much so that people are really struggling to get by in the most basic sorts of ways. And this is something we wanted to get across in our survey, is that in as much as we've been living with this disease for a long time, we also need to understand that things are really desperate in many parts of the country.
And did the survey go into the reasons why there is a loss of income?
Yeah, so I mean, we didn't go too much into depth as to what are the specific reasons, but I think what we gained from our survey is that a lot of people have lost their income or lost jobs. So this is sort of reflected in data from Stats SA or the Newzroom surveys from last year as well. So I think a loss of income has been the major source of financial insecurity. People have been quite positive in their response of the government, so they feel that the state is able to provide social assistance, so the social relief of distress grant, for example. But people losing, sort of seasonal or part-time work or even their primary occupation, that has been really detrimental to household finances over the last 6 months or the last year.
Your survey found that government can actually provide services to those who have been affected by job losses. But the people that you spoke to, were they people who ordinarily would be beneficiaries of the social grant system, or people who under normal, good circumstances would have been able to, I guess, pay their own way through and be able to support themselves and their families?
Sure. So our survey sample is nationally representative, so it's going to look like the adult population as a whole. So because social grants are very prevalent in our economy, before COVID, we had roughly 20 million people, obviously most of whom are children, but the recipients were still being paid out. So a large part of our sample, much like the adult population, was receiving social grants before, but not entirely. Since the pandemic, of course, many more people have become eligible for social assistance, so not only social grants, but also TERS payments, for example. So this is all included in our survey, but it's broadly representative of the adult population. I think what we see in our survey is that many people agree that the government can provide assistance through things like the TERS, the UIF, the social relief of distress grant. And this is actually quite encouraging that people believe that there is capacity within government to be able to support people who've lost jobs or income over the last year.
Did they perhaps comment on whether or not they think these intermediary measures by government are effective or not?
Yeah, so I think broadly speaking, we can sort of infer from these findings that people have thought they have been effective. I think we see that in our data. And then also sort of using more qualitative information from other civil society organizations. What we can also see is that people are quite appreciative of the additional assistance that's being provided. But of course, they think the amounts are far too little. So if you think 350 Rand for the social relief of distress grant, to survive for a month is very, very small amount, especially with inflation being the way it is. So I think people are generally supportive of the amount of support that's being offered, but in terms of the quality or the amount that's being made available to people who are in really desperate circumstances, I think there is a sort of general perception that it could be more sufficient.
I found this insight quite interesting, that almost half, about 47%, said they were unable to pay their debts or they'd lost their income, and that in the last 6 months, 54% of them say that they have lost loved ones during the same period. What can be inferred from this? Is this the loss of breadwinners, perhaps, in families that has caused this inability to pay their debts, or are these just, funeral expenses, those unaccounted, unexpected expenses that come up and then render you minus as far as your budget is concerned?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of all sorts of things. So on the debt example, we wanted to ask this specific question because many South Africans, in fact, almost a majority of the adult population, have some form of debt. So before the pandemic, actually, there were more people in South Africa who had debts than jobs. So debt is a massive problem in South Africa, and this is something we wanted to gauge. If you have an economic shock, for example, your ability to finance those debts becomes minimal. And then moving on to your question about losing loved ones, yeah, this is really what we wanted to gauge, was just what is the social experience of the pandemic? And our phrasing in the survey is, have you lost close friends or family members, for example? So this is really to underscore the scale of the pandemic and mortality in South Africa. We see the numbers quite regularly, but we forget that behind these numbers, of course, is an individual, a family member, a friend. And what we find in our survey is more than half of our samples say that they've lost a close friend or family member, which is really quite extraordinary if you think of the scale that this must be at. So this is a huge moment in our national history that I don't think we've adequately reckoned with. And then going to your point about losing breadwinners, yes, that's definitely something that can be related to household income. Of course, people rely on family members for grant income as well, for remittances, payments from family members in different parts of the country. So these are all related. The mortality, lack of ability to pay debts, loss of income. Unfortunately, the family is one of the sort of main sources of financial stability in South Africa. And when people lose loved ones, it really impacts on their resilience to economic shocks.
Now, in just a minute, if you could just summarize for us some of the key concerns in the order of importance that South Africans highlighted during this period. I found it quite interesting that hunger and starvation, that was a chief and paramount concern, followed by health.
Yeah, so this is one of the most important findings of this section of the survey, is we wanted to give South Africans the opportunity to highlight what are their main concerns. So we wanted to give a range of different options, from the threat of sort of personal violence, of crime, schooling and education. We know that schools have been disrupted over the last year or so. But what really came through was hunger and starvation was the primary threat given by our respondents, and the health of family members. So I think this sort of speaks to the almost incredible rise in food insecurity and general hunger in South Africa. So people have really struggled to access food. The price of food has increased tremendously as well over the last year. So these are the most basic elemental concerns that South Africans are having. And then linked to that as well, the sort of financial situation of your family and current and future employment and income, which around 1 in 5 respondents identified as their primary threat. So in as much as there's a whole lot of things going on with the COVID-19 pandemic, the threat of actually being infected is much lower in terms of South Africans' primary concerns than their sort of household financial circumstances, such as food security.
I guess it really is the realities of day-to-day and survival that seem to be topping that list. Thank you so much for those rather bleak studies, I must say. The results of that not very heartening at all during this time. That's Mikhail Moosa. He's project leader for the SA Reconciliation Barometer at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation.